Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that sits heavy. How did they do it? How did enslaved people survive the kind of labor that was designed to break them? We're not talking about a tough shift at work or a long day on your feet. We're talking about sunup to sundown, 6 or 7 days a week, month after month, year after year, in heat that could blister your skin and cold that could crack your hands open. We're talking about bodies pushed so far past their limits that the word exhaustion doesn't even begin to describe it. And yet, somehow, people endured. They found ways not just to survive the work, but to protect themselves within it, to carve out moments of rest and recovery, and even defiance inside a system that treated their bodies like fuel to be burned. Tonight, we're going to walk through a full day of enslaved labor, from the moment the horn sounded before dawn to the last tasks performed in darkness, and we're going to discover the quiet, remarkable strategies people used to make it through. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The day begins in darkness. You're lying on a wooden plank or a thin straw pallet in a cabin that holds the smell of too many bodies and not enough air. The walls are rough-hewn logs with mud crammed into the gaps, and even with the chinking, you can feel the outside creeping in. In winter, the cold settles on your face like a damp cloth. In summer, the cabin holds the heat from yesterday like an oven that never cools. You might have a blanket, a single coarse wool covering that was issued to you last fall and won't be replaced until next fall, assuming it doesn't fall apart before then. Your body aches in places you can't quite identify anymore. The pain has become so constant that it's less a sensation and more a state of being, something you carry the way other people carry their shadow. Your back, your shoulders, your hands, your knees, everything holds the memory of yesterday's labor, and in a few minutes it will all begin again. The horn blows, or the bell rings, or the overseer's voice cuts through the pre-dawn stillness with a sharpness that has its own kind of violence. The sound means get up, and get up means now, not in 5 minutes, not after you stretch the stiffness from your joints, not after you hold your sleeping child for one more breath. Now. The penalty for lateness varies by plantation and by overseer, but it almost always involves the whip, and the whip is the one consistency in a life where almost nothing else is certain. You rise in the dark and pull on your clothes, the same clothes you wore yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. Osnaburg cloth, a coarse fabric made from the cheapest fibers, rough enough to scratch raw skin, and thin enough to offer almost no protection against cold or heat. In winter, you might layer what you have, but what you have is almost nothing. In summer, the fabric clings to sweat and chafes in every crease of your body. Breakfast, if it exists, is a few minutes stolen from the darkness. A handful of cold cornbread left from the night before. Maybe a piece of salt pork that you've been rationing. The food goes down without ceremony because there's no time for ceremony, and because the food itself doesn't inspire any. It's fuel, calculated by the enslaver, to provide just enough energy to keep you working, and not a calorie more. The enslaver has done the math. He knows what a working body needs to stay functional, and he provides exactly that minimum, treating your nutrition the way he treats the feed for his mules, enough to keep the animal moving, not enough to make it comfortable. Your stomach processes what you've given it and immediately asks for more. but more isn't coming until the midday break, and sometimes not even then. You walk to the fields in a group, the sound of footsteps on packed earth the only music of the morning. The overseer is already there, mounted on horseback in the grey light, the whip coiled at his side like something alive and waiting. The driver, usually an enslaved man himself, chosen for his strength and put in the impossible position of enforcing the pace against his own people, takes his place at the front of the line. The driver carries his own whip, and the weight of it is psychological as much as physical. He knows that if the work falls behind, the overseer holds him responsible, and the overseer's whip doesn't distinguish between driver and field hand when quotas aren't met. This layered system of surveillance, the enslaver watching the overseer watching the driver watching the workers, was designed to make resistance feel impossible, to ensure that every pair of eyes was being watched by another pair of eyes. The work itself depended on what was being grown, but whatever the crop, the labor was relentless. On cotton plantations across the deep south, the cycle began in spring with ploughing and planting. You walked behind a mule or an ox, gripping the handles of a plough that bucked and jerked with every root and rock, the blade cutting furrows in soil that had been baked hard by the previous summer and frozen solid through winter. The plough didn't glide. It fought you, and you fought it back, mile after mile of straight rows that had to be precise because the overseer would check and the whip would correct any deviation. After ploughing came planting, bending to push seeds into the earth at intervals measured by habit and enforced by scrutiny. The bending was constant, your back curving and uncurving hundreds of times an hour, the muscles along your spine tightening into knots that would take years to undo if they ever undid at all. In summer came the chopping and the hoeing, the removal of weeds that competed with the cotton for sunlight and water. This was done by hand, with heavy hoes that jarred your arms and shoulders with each stroke, the impact traveling up through your wrists and elbows and settling deep in joints that were already inflamed from yesterday's work. The sun in Mississippi or Alabama in July is not merely hot. It's a physical force, a weight pressing down on your head and shoulders, baking the earth beneath your bare feet until the ground itself radiated heat upward into your body. The air shimmered and your vision blurred, and the sweat poured off you in quantities that your water ration couldn't replace. Heat stroke was common. People collapsed in the fields and were sometimes dragged to the shade and revived with water, sometimes whipped for falling behind, sometimes left where they fell because the work couldn't stop. But the worst of it was picking season. From August through December, the cotton had to come in. Each person was assigned a daily quota, a weight of cotton that had to be picked and brought to the gin house by the end of the day. These quotas varied by plantation, but commonly ranged from 100 to 200 pounds per day, and they were not suggestions. They were absolutes enforced by the weighing scale and the lash. The cruelty of the quota system was that it only ever moved in one direction. If you picked 150 pounds on a good day, that became your new baseline. The overseer noted it, remembered it, and expected it every day after. Picking more than your quota didn't earn you rest. It earned you a higher quota. Enslaved workers understood this trap intimately, and many deliberately held back their best effort, picking steadily at a pace just above the minimum threshold, saving their bodies from the escalating demands that came with demonstrating their full capacity. This calculated restraint was itself a survival strategy, a quiet negotiation with a system that punished both failure and excellence. You carried a long sack slung over your shoulder, dragging behind you as you moved down the rows, and you picked with both hands simultaneously, your fingers reaching into the sharp-edged bowls and pulling the white fiber free. The bowls cut. That's something that gets lost in the romantic imagery of cotton fields. The dried shells that held the cotton were hard and pointed, like tiny wooden claws, and by the end of the first day of picking season, your fingers were bleeding. By the end of the first week, they were raw and cracked and stinging with every touch. By the end of the season, your hands were scarred. The skin thickened into calluses that would never fully soften. Some workers wrapped their fingertips in cloth strips torn from their clothing, makeshift thimbles that offered slight protection, but that also slowed the picking, and therefore risked punishment. Others developed techniques for approaching the bowl at angles that minimized contact with the sharpest points. Small adjustments in hand position that could mean the difference between bleeding and not bleeding by the end of the day. This knowledge was shared among workers with the quiet urgency of people exchanging secrets that could save lives. The weight of the sack grew as the day progressed, the cotton accumulating pound by pound until you were dragging 50, 70, 100 pounds behind you through the rows. The strap dug into your shoulder, cutting into muscle that was already bruised from yesterday's strap, creating a groove in your flesh that became permanent over the years, a visible mark of the picking life carved into the body itself. Some workers switched the sack from shoulder to shoulder when they could, distributing the damage, trying to prevent any single point from bearing the full burden. Others developed a way of bracing the strap with their forearm, taking some of the weight off the shoulder at the cost of additional strain on the arm. Every adaptation was a calculation, a decision about which part of the body to sacrifice in order to preserve the rest. You picked steadily, rhythmically, because rhythm was survival. A steady pace conserved energy better than bursts of speed followed by exhaustion. The experienced pickers knew this. They had developed techniques over years of forced practice, ways of moving through the rows that minimized wasted motion, ways of reaching and pulling that protected the most damaged parts of their hands, ways of filling the sack that distributed the weight to avoid the worst strain on the shoulder. These techniques were survival knowledge, passed from older workers to younger ones in quiet moments of instruction that the enslavers saw as mere conversation. But it was education, a curriculum of endurance taught by people who had earned their expertise through suffering. The pacing strategies extended beyond individual technique. Enslaved workers developed collective approaches to managing the brutal quotas. In the gang labor system that dominated cotton and sugar plantations, workers moved through the fields together, and within those gangs, informal cooperation flourished. Stronger workers sometimes positioned themselves to help weaker ones. An experienced picker might work a row adjacent to a newer worker, occasionally dropping handfuls of cotton into the younger person's sack when the overseer wasn't watching. Mothers worked near their children when they could, shielding them from the worst of the sun and quietly supplementing their quotas. These acts of solidarity were small and easily missed, which was exactly the point. They had to be invisible to survive, acts of resistance disguised as mere proximity. The midday break, when it came, lasted anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours depending on the season and the enslaver's disposition. In the hottest months, some enslavers allowed longer breaks not out of compassion, but because they'd learned that workers who collapsed from heat stroke couldn't pick cotton at all. And a dead worker was a financial loss of $800 to $1,000 or more. The break was when you ate your main meal, usually brought to the fields by older workers or children too young for the heaviest labor. The food was cornbread and perhaps some beans or vegetables from the garden patches that enslaved people maintained in their scarce free time. You ate sitting in whatever shade you could find, your body cooling just enough to make the return to work bearable, your hands throbbing, your back settling into the ground as though it intended to grow roots there and never move again. These midday rest periods became crucial spaces for physical and social recovery. People stretched their bodies in ways that anticipated modern understanding of muscle care. Though they wouldn't have used those terms, they needed the tightness from each other's shoulders and backs, using techniques that had been brought from West Africa and adapted through generations of forced labor. They soaked their bleeding hands in whatever water was available, sometimes applying poultices made from plants they'd gathered, remedies known to reduce swelling and prevent infection. The knowledge of which plants helped and which didn't was precious, maintained by healers in the community, whose expertise was passed down with the same seriousness that European doctors passed down their far less effective medical traditions. Water was a constant concern. The human body performing heavy labor in summer heat requires enormous quantities of water, and the water provided to enslaved workers was often inadequate, sometimes contaminated, and always controlled. Water breaks were rationed. The bucket and dipper passed down the row at intervals determined by the overseer rather than by the bodies that needed it. Dehydration caused cramps, dizziness, confusion, and collapse, symptoms that were treated as laziness rather than medical emergencies, punished with the whip rather than with rest and fluids. Enslaved workers learned to drink as much as they could whenever the bucket came around, filling their stomachs with water that they knew their bodies would absorb before the next opportunity came. They learned to recognize the early signs of dehydration in themselves and others, the dryness of the mouth, the darkening of the urine, the headache that signaled the body's desperate plea for fluid, and they tried to protect each other when they could, passing the dipper to the person who needed it most, rather than keeping it for themselves. Some workers hid small containers of water in the fields, tucked beneath cotton plants or hidden near fence posts, insurance against the gaps between official water breaks that could stretch for hours in the worst heat. The children who worked alongside adults in the fields were especially vulnerable to dehydration and heat, their smaller bodies less able to regulate temperature and more quickly depleted of the fluids that sustained them. Mothers watched their children from neighboring rows with a vigilance that the work couldn't entirely suppress, alert for the stumble or the glazed expression that meant a child was reaching the limits of endurance. When they could, they sent their children to the water bucket more frequently, or found reasons to position them in the shadiest parts of the row, small acts of maternal protection performed within the rigid structure of a system that recognized no one's needs. The afternoon was the hardest part. The heat had been building since morning. The body's reserves of energy and hydration were depleted, and the hours between the midday break and sunset stretched like something elastic and cruel. This was when mistakes happened, when hose slipped and cut feet, when exhaustion clouded judgment and led to injuries that could become infections that could become death sentences in a world without antibiotics. This was when the whip was most active, the overseer sensing the flagging pace and responding with the only management technique the system truly valued: pain. The sound of the whip was itself a tool of labor management, the crack carrying across the fields and reaching workers who hadn't been struck, but who understood the message. Speed up. Don't slow down. Your body's limits are irrelevant. But enslaved people found ways to moderate the afternoon's cruelty. They developed work songs that served multiple functions simultaneously. The songs established a collective rhythm that helped pace the work, preventing the kind of frantic burst that led to exhaustion and collapse. They provided a psychological anchor, something to focus on besides the pain and the heat and the endless repetition of the same motions. They created a shared emotional experience that reinforced community bonds even within the isolation of individual suffering. And sometimes, beneath the melody and the rhythm, they carried information. Warnings about the overseer's approach, signals to slow down or speed up, coded messages about planned escapes or secret meetings. The work songs were survival technology disguised as music, tools of endurance that the enslavers tolerated because they believed the singing made the workers more productive, never understanding the layers of meaning that flowed beneath the surface. The task system, used primarily on rice plantations in the Carolina and Georgia Low Country, offered a different kind of survival calculation. Under this system, each worker was assigned a specific task for the day: a quarter acre of field to hoe, a certain number of rows to plant, a defined quantity of rice to thresh. When the task was complete, the remaining daylight hours belonged to the worker. This created a powerful incentive to work efficiently, and enslaved people became extraordinarily skilled at maximizing their productivity during task hours so they could claim the precious remainder for themselves. The time they earned was used for their own garden plots, for fishing and hunting, for craft work that could be sold or traded, for rest that their bodies desperately needed. The task system wasn't kindness. It was a different form of exploitation that happened to create space for limited autonomy. Enslavers used it because it reduced the need for constant supervision, and because it made workers essentially self-managing, freeing the enslaver from the costs of maintaining a large oversight apparatus. But enslaved people used the system's logic against itself, turning the efficiency it demanded into a tool for creating small zones of freedom within bondage. The skills they developed, the intimate knowledge of exactly how long each task required and how to complete it in minimum time, with minimum damage to their bodies, represented a form of expertise that the enslavers depended on but never acknowledged. As the sun began its descent, the pace didn't always slow. On cotton plantations during picking season, every minute of remaining light was precious, and the overseer drove the pace until the darkness made it impossible to distinguish white cotton from the leaves that surrounded it. Only then were the workers allowed to stop picking, but the day wasn't over. The cotton had to be carried to the gin house, the sacks weighed, the totals recorded against each person's quota. The weighing was a moment of intense anxiety. A good weight meant safety until tomorrow. A light weight meant the lash, administered publicly as a lesson to everyone watching. The scale was the final arbiter of each day, a judge that rendered its verdict in pounds and ounces, and whose sentence was carried out immediately and without appeal. After the weighing came the evening chores: feeding animals, carrying wood, hauling water, repairing tools, cleaning the processing equipment. These tasks fell on the same bodies that had been laboring since before dawn, bodies that were already running on empty and now being asked to give whatever remained. The cruelty of evening chores was their ordinariness, the way they demanded physical effort at the exact moment when every cell in your body was screaming for rest. You carried armloads of wood that felt 10 times heavier than they would have that morning. You hauled buckets of water from the well, the rope burning across palms that were already torn from the day's work. You swept and cleaned and organized because the plantation was a machine, and the machine required maintenance, and you were both the operator and the fuel. Only after the evening chores were complete could workers return to their cabins, where the final essential labor of the day awaited, preparing food for themselves and their families, The rations had to be cooked, the cornmeal ground if it hadn't been already, the small garden plots tended in the last scraps of daylight. The gardens were critical. They were the difference between mere survival and something approaching adequate nutrition. Small patches of ground where enslaved families grew the vegetables and herbs that the enslavers' rations didn't include. Collard greens, sweet potatoes, black-eyed peas, okra. These crops supplemented the cornmeal and pork fat diet that was all the enslaver provided. The gardens required time and energy that barely existed, but people tended them anyway because the alternative was slow starvation on a diet designed to keep you working and nothing more. Women bore a disproportionate burden in these evening hours, expected to do the domestic labor that sustained families after having performed the same field labor as the men all day. They cooked over open fires in front of their cabins, stirring pots of whatever they had, stretching ingredients that were never enough to fill the stomachs waiting for them. They nursed infants who had been watched by elderly workers or older children during the day, their bodies producing milk despite the depletion of a full day's labor in the fields. They mended clothing that was constantly wearing out, patched the coarse Osnaburg fabric until the patches needed patches of their own. They washed what could be washed, cleaned what could be cleaned, and held families together through acts of care that were themselves a form of labor, unpaid and unacknowledged, performed in the narrow margin between the enslaver's workday and the body's collapse into sleep. The cooking itself was an act of cultural preservation and creative genius. Enslaved cooks transformed the most limited ingredients into dishes that nourished both body and spirit, drawing on West African culinary traditions that valued one-pot cooking, complex seasoning, and the use of every part of an animal or plant. The techniques for making cornbread, for seasoning pot liquor, for slow cooking beans with whatever scraps of meat were available. These were skills passed from mother to daughter and from community elder to community younger, a culinary inheritance that the enslavers never recognized as the sophisticated food culture it was. The smoke from these evening cooking fires rose into the twilight and mingled with the voices of families finally gathered together, children finally close enough to touch. The day's labor finally, temporarily, over. The evening was also when the body began its inadequate process of recovery. Muscles that had been clenched and strained for 14 or 15 hours started to release, and the release itself was painful, the blood flowing back into tissues that had been compressed and depleted. Feet swelled inside shoes or bare against the cabin floor. Hands throbbed with each heartbeat, the cuts from the cotton bolls or the cane leaves pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to count out the hours until the horn would sound again. The cuts and scratches from whatever the crop had inflicted stung as sweat dried and salt crystallized in the wounds. People tended to each other's injuries with whatever they had. Cool water, poultices of crushed herbs, strips of cloth torn from worn-out garments and used as bandages. The medical knowledge that circulated through enslaved communities was extensive, practical, and often remarkably effective, drawing on traditions from multiple African cultures and supplemented by generations of observation about American plants and their properties. Root doctors and herb women held positions of respect and authority within the community, their knowledge a lifeline that the formal medical system either couldn't or wouldn't provide. They knew that sassafras bark could ease aching joints, that the leaves of the Jimson weed could reduce swelling when applied as a compress, that certain teas brewed from forest plants could quiet coughs and settle stomachs. This healing knowledge was guarded and shared with intention, passed to trusted individuals who demonstrated both the aptitude and the character to use it wisely. A chain of medical transmission as serious and deliberate as any formal education. The cabin itself, for all its discomforts, became a space of recovery when the day was done. The proximity of bodies that had worked together all day created a warmth that the structure alone couldn't provide. The shared heat of family members lying close together on pallets that were barely adequate. Children curled against parents. Couples lay pressed together, their bodies fitting into the familiar shapes of each other. The physical closeness a form of comfort that required no words. The sounds of the cabin settling, the creak of wooden planks, the whisper of straw shifting beneath bodies that were finding their sleeping positions. These small sounds became the lullaby of the enslaved household, the quiet signal that the day's demands had finally relented. Sleep itself was a survival strategy, and enslaved people understood its importance even if the system conspired to deny them enough of it. The average enslaved worker got perhaps 5 or 6 hours of sleep per night during the busiest seasons, far less than what the body needs to repair the damage of heavy labor. The sleep was often interrupted by children, by pain, by the sounds of the plantation at night, by the anxiety of knowing that the horn would sound again in a few hours, and the whole cycle would begin again. But people learned to fall asleep quickly and to sleep deeply when they could, their bodies so exhausted that unconsciousness came as a kind of mercy, the one period of the day when the labor stopped and the body could direct its resources toward healing rather than working. Some workers reported that they could fall asleep in any position, standing, leaning against a fence post, sitting on a stump during a stolen moment, the body so desperate for rest that it seized every opportunity with the urgency of drowning person reaching for air. The spiritual practices that sustained enslaved communities were deeply intertwined with the experience of labor. The brush arbor meetings held in secret clearings in the woods were spaces where people could express their exhaustion and their grief, where they could sing and pray and testify without the overseer's surveillance, where the weight of the work could be shared and thereby lightened. These meetings happened at night, carved from the few hours between the end of work and the beginning of sleep, and the fact that people sacrifice precious rest to attend them tells you everything about how essential spiritual sustenance was to surviving the physical demands of the day. The theology that emerged from these gatherings was a theology of endurance and ultimate liberation, drawing on the Hebrew Bible's narratives of slavery and deliverance, finding in the story of the Israelites in Egypt a promise that suffering was not permanent, that God saw the labor and the pain and would eventually act. This was not passive resignation. It was active hope, a deliberate choice to believe in a future different from the present, to maintain spiritual reserves that the body's reserves alone couldn't sustain. The Saturday night gatherings that some enslavers permitted, the dances and music making that took place in the quarters after the week's work was complete, served similar functions of restoration. The music healed in ways that were difficult to articulate, but unmistakable to experience. The banjo and the fiddle and the drums made from whatever materials were available. The singing that rose from groups of people who had spent the week in enforced silence or limited speech. The dancing that used the same bodies that had been instruments of labor all week, but now became instruments of joy. All of this was recovery. Not just physical recovery, though the release of tension through movement and rhythm certainly helped, but psychological and spiritual recovery, the reassertion of humanity in a system designed to deny it. You are more than what they say you are. That was the message of every song, every dance, every shared moment of laughter in the quarters. You are more than a pair of hands in a cotton field. You are a person, and your people remember, and tomorrow we endure again together. The physical toll of decades of forced labor was cumulative and devastating. Enslaved people aged far beyond their years, their bodies worn down by work that never allowed adequate recovery. People in their 30s moved like people in their 60s, their joints swollen, their backs permanently curved, their hands gnarled from gripping tools for tens of thousands of hours. The spine problems that afflicted virtually every field worker were not merely painful. They were structural. The vertebrae compressed, and the disc deteriorated by years of bending and lifting and carrying loads that the body was never designed to bear for such sustained periods. Respiratory problems from dust and pollen and the smoke of curing barns or sugar-boiling houses accumulated silently, each season adding another layer of damage to lungs that had no opportunity to heal. The seasonal cycle meant that the body never fully recovered before the next assault began. Winter offered slightly less demanding labor on some plantations, the shorter days providing a few more hours of darkness in which to sleep, the cooler temperatures easing the worst of the heat-related suffering. But winter brought its own miseries, the cold that penetrated inadequate clothing, the mud that made every step heavier, the respiratory infections that spread through crowded cabins with lethal efficiency. Pneumonia killed enslaved workers with a regularity that the enslavers noted in their account books, with the same detachment they used to record the death of livestock. A worker who died in January was replaced by spring. The cost of purchase charged against the year's expected profits, the human being reduced to a line in a ledger. Spring meant renewed intensity as the planting season demanded every available hour. Summer meant the worst heat and the longest days, the body pushed to its absolute limits by the combination of physical demand and environmental assault. Fall meant the harvest, the most intense period of all, when quotas were highest and punishment most severe, and the daylight hours were consumed entirely by the desperate race to bring the crop in before weather destroyed it. There was no off-season, no vacation, no sabbatical. There was only the endless rotation of the agricultural year, each season bringing its characteristic form of suffering, each year adding to the accumulated damage that shortened lives and destroyed bodies. Women faced additional physical burdens that the labor system intensified rather than accommodated. Pregnancy offered no exemption from field work on most plantations. Women worked through their pregnancies until the final weeks, their swelling bodies bending and lifting and hoeing alongside everyone else. The risk of miscarriage increased by the very labor they were forced to perform. After giving birth, the recovery period was brutally short, sometimes just days before they were expected to return to the fields. Nursing mothers were sometimes allowed brief breaks to feed their infants, but these breaks were grudging concessions that could be revoked at any time, and the babies left in the care of others during the long working hours often received inadequate attention from caretakers, who were themselves too old or too young or too exhausted to provide what an infant needed. And yet people survived. They survived because they had to, because giving up meant death or the destruction of families that depended on them, because the will to live is perhaps the most stubborn force in human nature. They survived because they helped each other, because the community absorbed individual suffering and distributed it across many shoulders. They survived because they were resourceful, finding nutrition in gardens and forests and streams when the rations fell short, finding medicine in plants when doctors were unavailable or incompetent, finding rest in stolen minutes and abbreviated nights. They survived because they were skilled, mastering the techniques of labor so thoroughly that they could work efficiently enough to meet quotas, while conserving the energy their bodies needed to last another day, another season, another year. The knowledge of how to survive forced labor was itself a form of inheritance, passed from generation to generation with a seriousness that reflected its life or death importance. Parents taught children how to pace themselves, how to protect their hands, how to read the overseer's mood and adjust their behavior accordingly, how to conserve energy during the parts of the day when surveillance was lightest, how to present the appearance of maximum effort while holding something in reserve for the hours when the body would need it most. Older workers mentored younger ones in the specific techniques of each crop, each season, each task, sharing the hard-won wisdom of decades of experience. A grandmother might show a granddaughter exactly how to angle her hoe to minimize the shock traveling up her arms. An uncle might teach a nephew the precise rhythm of picking that would keep his fingers moving without exhausting his hands. This transmission of knowledge was one of the ways enslaved communities maintained continuity and resilience across generations, ensuring that each new group of workers had access to the survival strategies that their predecessors had developed through years of painful trial. The enslavers never recognized this knowledge system for what it was. They saw field hands, not experts. They saw labor, not skill. But the skills were real, and they were the reason people survived conditions that should have been unsurvivable. Tonight, as you lie in your bed, think about the hands that picked the cotton and cut the cane and hoed the rice and built the wealth of a nation that refused to acknowledge their humanity. Think about the bodies that absorbed punishment that would have broken most people and kept moving, kept working, kept living, kept finding reasons to endure another day. Think about the minds that developed strategies for survival so sophisticated that they constituted their own form of genius, a genius born not in universities, but in fields and cabins and secret gatherings under the trees. Think about the hearts that maintained the capacity for love and hope and faith, despite conditions designed to destroy all three, that found ways to nurture children and sustain marriages and build community in the narrow margins left by a system that claimed every waking hour and most of the sleeping ones too. The people who endured this labor didn't just survive. They carried forward the cultural traditions, the family bonds, the spiritual practices, and the sheer stubborn vitality that would sustain their descendants through the generations that followed. Their endurance is not merely a historical fact. It is a living inheritance present in every community they built, every song they sang, every child they raised to believe that tomorrow could be different from today. That's the legacy that outlasted the fields and the whips and the scales. The legacy that deserves to be remembered as you drift peacefully into sleep tonight. Let's start at the beginning, before the first ship ever crossed the Atlantic, with human cargo in its hold. The year is somewhere in the early 1400s, and the Portuguese are poking their way down the western coast of Africa, looking for gold and a sea route to the spice markets of Asia. Prince Henry the Navigator, sitting in his palace on the southwestern tip of Europe, is sending expedition after expedition into waters that European sailors had feared for centuries. They're not initially thinking about slavery on a massive scale. That's not the plan. The plan is wealth through trade, through finding new routes to old riches. Slavery existed in Europe, existed in Africa, existed in Asia, existed pretty much everywhere humans had figured out that forcing other humans to work was profitable. But it was relatively small scale, local, often temporary. Enslaved people in medieval Europe were often white, taken from Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean borderlands. The word slave itself derives from Slav, a reminder of who filled that category in earlier centuries. What the Portuguese stumbled into would become something entirely different, something unprecedented in human history. They found the gold they were looking for, establishing trading relationships with African kingdoms that had been mining the precious metal for generations. And they found something else too, a coastline stretching thousands of miles, populated by diverse kingdoms and peoples, some of whom were willing to trade captives for European goods. At first the trade was modest, a few captives here and there, exchanged for textiles and metal tools and trinkets that seemed valuable to both parties. These early captives were transported back to Portugal, where they worked as domestic servants and labourers, curiosities as much as commodities. Others went to the newly colonised Atlantic islands, Madeira and the Canaries, and eventually São Tomé, where sugar plantations were beginning to transform the landscape and create an appetite for labour that local populations couldn't satisfy. Nobody knew it yet, but they were laying the foundation for a system that would consume millions of lives and reshape the world. Here's where geography and economics collide to create catastrophe. Christopher Columbus bumbles his way across the Atlantic in 1492, thinking he's found Asia, actually finding the Caribbean. Within decades, the Spanish are colonizing islands and mainlands, discovering that the indigenous populations are dying at catastrophic rates from European diseases, from brutal labor conditions, from the general violence of conquest. The Spanish need workers. They need bodies to mine silver, to grow sugar, to build the infrastructure of empire. And they need them in numbers that the decimated indigenous populations can no longer provide. The solution arrives from across the ocean. African captives, already being traded in small numbers, suddenly become the answer to a labor crisis of colonial making. The first enslaved Africans arrive in the Americas in the early 1500s, and the floodgates begin to crack open. Now let's talk about how this actually worked, because the slave trade wasn't a simple transaction. It was a complex system involving multiple continents, dozens of nations, countless middlemen, and economic incentives so powerful they overwhelmed whatever moral objections might have existed. The trade operated on what historians call the triangular route, though the reality was messier than any neat geometric shape. Ships left European ports loaded with manufactured goods, textiles, metal tools, weapons, alcohol, beads, and countless other items. They sailed to the West African coast, where these goods were exchanged for human beings. The ships then crossed the Atlantic, the infamous Middle Passage, carrying their human cargo to the Americas. There, the surviving captives were sold, and the ships loaded up with colonial products, sugar, tobacco, cotton, rum, and sailed back to Europe to complete the triangle. Each leg of the journey generated profit. Each leg depended on the others. The whole system was elegantly horrible in its economic efficiency. But we need to slow down and look at what was actually happening on the African coast, because the story is more complicated than Europeans simply raiding villages and grabbing people. That happened, especially in the early years, but it wasn't sustainable, and it wasn't how most of the trade actually functioned. Instead, Europeans established trading posts along the coast, fortified positions where they could store goods and captives, negotiate with local powers, and wait for the ships that would carry their purchases across the ocean. They called these factories, though nothing was manufactured there except human misery. The captives who ended up in these factories came from the interior, often marched hundreds of miles from their homes, sold through networks of African traders and rulers who had their own reasons for participating in the trade. Here's a truth that makes some people uncomfortable, but needs to be told honestly. African participation in the slave trade was real and significant. Some African kingdoms grew wealthy and powerful by capturing and selling their neighbors. Some rulers traded war captives, criminals, or people from rival ethnic groups, not fully understanding or not caring about the scale of what they were feeding. Some were coerced, facing European military pressure or economic dependency that left them few choices. The dynamics varied enormously across time and place, and it would be wrong to either excuse European responsibility by pointing to African participation or to pretend that Africans were simply victims with no agency in the process. The trade corrupted everyone it touched. It incentivized warfare, raiding, and kidnapping across vast stretches of the continent. It destabilized societies and distorted economies. It turned human beings into the most valuable export commodity Africa possessed, with consequences that would echo for centuries. Now imagine yourself as one of the captured. You're going about your life in a village somewhere in the interior, maybe farming millet or yams, maybe herding cattle, maybe working as a craftsman or trader, maybe just existing in the rhythms of ordinary days that had structured your family's life for generations. You have a name, a history, a place in a community that knows you. You have relationships, obligations, hopes for the future, and then everything ends. Maybe raiders attack at dawn, burning homes and grabbing anyone they can catch. Professional slave hunters who have done this before and will do it again. Maybe you're taken in a war between neighboring peoples, a war that might have happened anyway, but is now fueled by the knowledge that captives mean wealth, that European traders will pay well for the people on the losing side. Maybe you're sold by your own community for a crime real or invented, or to settle a debt, or because a local chief needs trade goods more than he needs you, or because famine has made every mouth a burden, and yours can be exchanged for something that might help others survive. However it happens, the result is the same. You find yourself bound, hands tied behind your back, or neck locked into a wooden yoke that connects you to the person in front of you and the person behind. You're marched away from everything you've ever known, joined by dozens or hundreds of others in the same terrible situation. The march to the coast could take weeks or months depending on where you started. You walk until your feet bleed, then you walk on the bleeding feet, because stopping isn't an option. You're fed barely enough to keep you moving, often just enough to prevent you from collapsing entirely. The guards watch constantly, armed and willing to kill anyone who can't continue, anyone who tries to escape, anyone who causes too much trouble. Some people die on these marches, from exhaustion, from disease, from despair so deep it simply stops the heart. Some people escape, slipping away in the night, and somehow making it back to what's left of home. Most just keep walking, stunned by the catastrophe that has overtaken their lives, unable to fully process what is happening or what it means. You pass through villages that watch you go, some hostile, some sympathetic, all powerless to help. You cross rivers and climb hills and traverse landscapes that grow increasingly unfamiliar. The vegetation changes, the language changes, the faces around you change as some captives are sold off and others are added to the coffle. By the time you reach the coast, you may have been walking for 2 months. You may have lost a third of the people who started the journey with you. You may have forgotten what it felt like to not be exhausted, to not be hungry, to not be afraid. You reach the coast and you see the ocean for the first time. If you're from the interior, as most captives were, you might never have seen so much water, might not have known such a thing was possible. The endless expanse of it, stretching to the horizon in every direction, must have seemed like the edge of the world, and in a sense, it was. Everything you knew was behind you. Everything ahead was unknown, unimaginable, terrifying. The European trading post looms ahead. Stone walls and cannons. Strange pale men with stranger clothes speaking languages you can't understand. These fortified positions dotted the West African coast, each one a node in the network that was draining the continent of its people. They had names that would become infamous: Elmina, Cape Coast, Gore, Bunce Island. They had dungeons beneath them where captives waited in darkness for the ships that would carry them away. You're inspected like livestock, your teeth checked for signs of age or disease, your muscles squeezed to assess your capacity for labor, your body examined for defects that might lower your price. Men had their genitals inspected. Women had their breasts examined. Children were measured against standards that determined whether they counted as full cargo or partial. The humiliation was systematic, designed to reduce you from a person to a product, to begin the process of dehumanization that would continue for the rest of your life. If you pass inspection, you're purchased, your price calculated in units of trade goods, so many yards of cloth, so many iron bars, so many guns, so much alcohol. If you don't pass, your fate might be worse, left to die in the dungeons, or sold to local buyers for whatever they'll pay. The ones who are bought are branded, literally burned with hot irons to mark them as property of this or that trading company, the initials seared into shoulder or chest or breast. The pain is searing and the scar is permanent, a mark you'll carry forever, a symbol of what has been done to you that can never be erased. Then you wait. You wait in dungeons beneath the trading posts, dark and airless spaces where hundreds of people are crammed together, waiting for the ship that will carry you away from everything. The dungeons at Cape Coast Castle could hold 1,000 captives at a time. The dungeons at Elmina were tunnels carved into rock, dripping with moisture, crawling with vermin. The waiting could last weeks or even months, depending on when the next ship arrived and how long it took to fill its hold. People died in those dungeons, from disease, from despair, from the sheer impossibility of processing what was happening to them. Some went mad. Some found ways to end their own lives. The survivors boarded the ships and faced something even worse. The Middle Passage. Those two words contain more suffering than any phrase should be asked to hold. The journey from Africa to the Americas typically took 6 to 8 weeks, though weather and circumstance could stretch it to 3 months or more. During that time, captives were packed into the holds of ships in conditions that defy description, though we'll try anyway, because bearing witness matters, because looking away is its own form of complicity. The ships were designed to maximize cargo, and the cargo was human beings. Naval architects debated the most efficient way to pack bodies into wooden hulls, some favoring loose packing that might reduce mortality, others preferring tight packing that would deliver more survivors even if the death rate was higher. The debate was conducted in the language of commerce, not humanity. People were chained together in rows, iron shackles around ankles and wrists, forced to lie on wooden platforms with barely enough space to turn over, stacked in tiers like merchandise in a warehouse. The space allotted to each person was sometimes no more than 16 inches wide and 5.5 feet long. Less room than a coffin provides. The height between decks might be only 4 or 5 feet, not enough for an adult to stand. You lay there in the darkness, pressed against strangers who had become intimate by proximity, if nothing else, feeling the ship roll beneath you, hearing sounds you couldn't identify, smelling smells you wished you couldn't. The heat below decks was suffocating, the tropical Atlantic providing no relief, the bodies of hundreds of people generating warmth that had nowhere to go. Ventilation was minimal, often just a few grates in the deck above, that let in some air and some light, but never enough of either. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat, of waste, of vomit, of fear, of death. People relieved themselves where they lay because there was nowhere else to do it, the waste accumulating beneath them, seeping through the boards, creating conditions that bred disease with terrible efficiency. The captives were brought above deck occasionally for air and exercise, forced to dance to keep their muscles from atrophying completely, whipped if they didn't move with sufficient enthusiasm. It was a grotesque parody of human activity, serving the purely economic purpose of delivering healthy merchandise to market. The crews didn't enjoy the voyages either, though their suffering was nothing compared to what lay below decks. They got sick from the same diseases that ravaged the captives. They lived in fear of the uprisings that occurred on roughly 1 in 10 voyages. They developed psychological strategies for not thinking about what they were doing, not looking at the people in the hold as people, not questioning a trade that paid their wages. Some of them were brutal, taking out frustrations on captives who couldn't fight back. Others tried to maintain some minimal standard of treatment, not from compassion, but from the understanding that dead cargo meant lost profit. The ships themselves became saturated with the trade, the wood soaked with odors that never fully dissipated, vessels known as slavers, even when they carried other cargo. Disease swept through the ships like fire through dry grass. Dysentery was endemic, people lying in their own waste, and the waste of those chained beside them, because there was nowhere else for it to go. Smallpox appeared and spread in the close quarters, killing some and scarring others. Fevers of various kinds took their toll. The crews got sick too, though they at least had access to fresh air and better food. Mortality rates on the Middle Passage varied depending on the ship, the route, the era, and sheer luck, but something like 15% of captives died during the crossing on average. That's nearly 2 million people who never reached the Americas, whose bodies were thrown overboard to feed the sharks that learned to follow the slave ships, who died in chains in the darkness of a ship's hold, thousands of miles from home. Some captives chose death rather than continue. They refused to eat, forcing the crews to use devices that pried open their jaws and forced food down their throats. Some threw themselves overboard when they got the chance, choosing the ocean over whatever waited on the other side. Let's talk about the scale, because numbers this large can become abstractions if we're not careful. Over the 4 centuries that the transatlantic slave trade operated, approximately 12 million Africans were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 10.5 million survived the crossing. They came from regions stretching from present-day Senegal to Angola, from ethnic groups speaking hundreds of different languages, practicing different religions, carrying different traditions. They were Yoruba and Igbo, Akan and Fon, Congo and Mbundu, and dozens of other peoples whose names and histories were systematically erased by a system that didn't care who you were, only what you could produce. The trade peaked in the 1700s, when ships were crossing the Atlantic at a pace that would have been unimaginable a century earlier, when the sugar plantations of the Caribbean and Brazil had an appetite for labor that seemed bottomless, when the whole Atlantic economy ran on the fuel of stolen lives. Now let's follow the survivors to their destinations, because the Middle Passage was not the end of the horror. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would last the rest of their lives and the lives of their descendants for generations to come. The ships arrived at ports throughout the Americas: Rio de Janeiro and Bahia in Brazil, Havana and Santiago in Cuba, Kingston and Bridgetown in the Caribbean, Charleston and New Orleans, and 100 smaller harbors where human beings were unloaded and prepared for sale. The captives were cleaned up, their wounds treated or hidden with tar and oil, their bodies oiled to make them look healthier than they were. Some were given better food for a few days, fattened up like livestock before market. Grey hair was dyed black. Signs of disease were concealed. Everything was done to maximize the price. They were marched to auction blocks where planters and merchants and speculators gathered to inspect them, handling them like animals, checking teeth and muscles, looking for signs of defiance or docility, making judgments about how much labor could be extracted from each body. Families that had managed to stay together through the capture and the march and the dungeons and the crossing were separated here, sold to different buyers, sent to different plantations, sometimes to different colonies, hundreds of miles apart. Children were torn from mothers, the screaming audible to everyone present, ignored by everyone with the power to prevent it. Husbands were separated from wives who they would never see again. Siblings were scattered like seeds in the wind. The social bonds that had survived everything else were deliberately destroyed because isolated individuals were easier to control than people with connections and loyalties and networks of support. The destinations shaped the experience of slavery in ways that mattered enormously, even though all slavery was brutal by definition. Most enslaved Africans ended up in Brazil or the Caribbean, where sugar was king, and the labor regime was designed to extract maximum production regardless of human cost. Sugar was the oil of its era, the commodity that Europeans craved, the foundation of fortunes and empires, and it was produced under conditions that can only be described as industrial murder. The sugar plantations were killing fields. Work in the cane fields was brutal, dangerous, and unrelenting. The cane had to be cut during a narrow harvest window, meaning 18-hour days during the busiest season. The stalks were sharp and tough. The sun was relentless. The overseers were quick with the whip. The processing of sugar was even, more dangerous than the field work. Boiling cane juice in massive copper vats required round-the-clock labor near open flames and scalding liquids. Workers lost arms to the grinding mills that crushed the cane. They suffered horrible burns from splashing syrup. They collapsed from exhaustion and heat and were dragged aside so the work could continue. Injuries were common. Death was common. The planters calculated that it was cheaper to work enslaved people to death and buy replacements than to treat them well enough to live long lives. This wasn't hidden. It was openly discussed in the economic literature of the time, debated as a matter of business strategy. In some Caribbean colonies, the enslaved population couldn't reproduce itself. More people died than were born, and the population was only maintained through constant importation of new captives from Africa. This is what the economics of sugar created, a perpetual death machine fed by the Middle Passage. North America received a smaller share of the trade, perhaps 400,000 captives total, but developed its own horrific variation. The enslaved population in what would become the United States did reproduce and grow, reaching nearly 4 million by the time of the Civil War, all descended from that original 400,000. This meant that North American slavery became self-sustaining in a way that Caribbean slavery never did, less dependent on the Atlantic trade, but no less brutal in its daily operation. The cotton plantations of the Deep South, which boomed after the invention of the cotton gin, created their own version of the sugar plantation's deadly efficiency. And throughout the Americas, in every colony and nation that practiced slavery, the same fundamental reality applied. Human beings were property, their labor was extracted by force, and their lives were valued only insofar as they produced wealth for others. The trade itself was enormously profitable for those who ran it. European merchants grew rich on the buying and selling of human beings. Port cities like Liverpool, Nantes, and Amsterdam flourished on the proceeds. Banks and insurance companies that still exist today got their start financing slave voyages and insuring their human cargo. The wealth generated by the slave trade and slave labor flowed into the broader European economy, funding industrialization, building mansions, endowing universities, creating the material foundation for the modern world. This isn't speculation or exaggeration. It's documented history, traceable in account books and shipping records, visible in the grand buildings that still stand in cities that would rather forget how the money was made. Let's talk about resistance, because the enslaved people of the Atlantic world never simply accepted their fate. From the moment of capture to the last days of slavery, resistance took many forms, from the dramatic to the everyday, from armed rebellion to quiet sabotage, from running away to maintaining cultural practices that the enslavers wanted to destroy. On the ships of the Middle Passage, uprisings occurred regularly enough that crews lived in constant fear, armed themselves heavily, and developed elaborate security procedures to prevent the captives from ever having an opportunity to act together. The men were kept in chains almost constantly. The women, often left unchained because they were considered less dangerous, sometimes used that relative freedom to steal weapons or relay information between groups of captives. Most shipboard rebellions failed. Put down with brutal violence, the leaders executed in ways designed to terrorize the survivors into submission. They were shot, hanged from the mast, dismembered and thrown overboard piece by piece, while others were forced to watch. The punishment was spectacular because it had to be. The crews were always outnumbered by their cargo, and they knew that only fear kept them in control. But some rebellions succeeded. Some ships were taken over by their captives, turned around, sailed back toward Africa by people who had never operated a European vessel before, but figured it out because the alternative was unbearable. The records of these successful uprisings are scarce because no one wanted to advertise that the trade could be disrupted, but they happened, and they mattered. In the Americas, rebellions erupted throughout the centuries of slavery. Too many to count, too important to ignore. Some were small and quickly crushed. Handfuls of enslaved people on single plantations who rose up against their immediate oppressors and were overwhelmed by the military force that colonial powers could bring to bear. Others shook colonial societies to their foundations, spreading across wide areas, lasting for months, requiring armies to suppress. Jamaica saw major rebellions repeatedly, the mountainous interior providing refuge for maroon communities of escaped slaves who fought the British to a standstill, and eventually won treaties recognizing their autonomy. Brazil had Palmares, a confederation of escaped slave settlements that lasted nearly a century, and at its height numbered tens of thousands of people. The colonial authorities eventually destroyed it, but for generations it stood as proof that another way of living was possible. The Haitian Revolution stands as the most successful slave revolt in history, a transformation so complete that it still astonishes. Beginning in 1791 and culminating in independence in 1804, it saw enslaved people defeat the armies of France, Spain, and Britain, destroying the most profitable colony in the Caribbean and establishing the first nation founded by former slaves. The revolution was led by men like Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, former slaves who became generals and statesmen, who outmaneuvered European powers and created something unprecedented. It terrified slaveholders throughout the Americas who saw in Haiti a vision of what might happen if they lost control. It inspired enslaved people everywhere, proving that the system could be overthrown, that freedom could be seized rather than granted. The ripple effects influenced everything from the Louisiana Purchase to the hardening of slave codes throughout the American South, as slaveholders responded to their fear with increased brutality. But even smaller acts of resistance mattered. Running away, even when recapture was likely, asserted that the enslaved person was a human being who desired freedom, not a contented piece of property. Breaking tools slowed down production and cost the enslaver money. Working slowly, feigning illness, pretending not to understand instructions, all of these were ways of reclaiming small pieces of autonomy within a system of total domination. Maintaining African cultural practices, speaking African languages, practicing African religions or syncretic versions that blended African and Christian elements. These were ways of preserving identity against a system that wanted to reduce human beings to interchangeable units of labor. Learning to read despite prohibitions, which happened far more often than the enslavers realized, was an act of rebellion that opened doors to other forms of resistance. Every act of resistance, from the largest rebellion to the smallest act of defiance, was a refusal to accept the terms the enslavers tried to impose. The end of the trade came gradually, driven by a complex mixture of moral awakening, economic calculation, political pressure, and the resistance of enslaved people themselves. Britain, which had been one of the largest slave trading nations, accumulating enormous wealth from the traffic in human beings, abolished the trade in 1807 and then spent decades using its naval power to suppress the trade by others. The West Africa Squadron patrolled the African coast, intercepting slave ships and freeing their captives, though the freed people often ended up in British colonies as nominally free labourers whose conditions weren't always much better than slavery. The British motivation was partly genuine abolitionism, the result of decades of activist campaigning led by people like William Wilberforce and Olaudah Equiano, a former slave whose autobiography helped turn public opinion against the trade. The abolitionists made slavery a moral issue in ways it hadn't been before, forcing people to confront the reality of what the trade involved, using images and testimony and economic arguments to build a movement that eventually became politically irresistible. But British motivation was also partly economic self-interest. Britain had transitioned to different forms of colonial exploitation, finding that wage labor in some contexts was actually more profitable than slave labor, especially when someone else was bearing the costs of housing and feeding the workers. Having already accumulated enormous capital from the slave trade and slave-produced commodities, Britain found it convenient to handicap competitors who still relied on the trade, to claim moral superiority while enforcing economic disadvantage. The reality was messier than either a purely moral or purely economic explanation would suggest. Both factors were present, intertwined, impossible to fully separate. The United States banned the importation of enslaved Africans in the same year, 1807, though slavery itself continued for another 6 decades, and an illegal trade persisted in smaller volumes. Ships still landed cargoes of captives on American shores throughout the antebellum period, their captains and crews risking prosecution for profits that made the risk worthwhile. The domestic slave trade, the buying and selling of people already in America, continued legally and massively, with an estimated 1 million enslaved people forcibly moved from the Upper South to the Deep South between 1790 and 1860. This internal trade was in some ways even more traumatic than the Middle Passage, because it separated families who had known each other, communities that had been together for generations, people who had built lives that were destroyed for the profit of others. The last slave ship to land in the United States arrived in 1860, just a year before the Civil War began. The Clotilda carried over 100 captives from West Africa to Alabama, its cargo quickly hidden and the ship burned to destroy evidence. The survivors lived for decades, and the last of them, a woman named Ridoshi, died in 1937, a living link to the Middle Passage in living memory. Brazil didn't fully end its participation until 1888, the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. By then, the trade had been declining for decades, squeezed by naval patrols, changing economics, and the slow spread of abolition across the hemisphere. Cuba and Puerto Rico had ended slavery in the 1870s and 1880s. The British Caribbean had been free since the 1830s. The American Civil War had destroyed slavery in the United States, but 4 centuries of damage couldn't be undone by legislation. The 12 million people who crossed the Atlantic, the millions more who died before they could be loaded onto ships, the societies disrupted across Africa, the wealth extracted and accumulated in Europe and the Americas, all of this had reshaped the world in ways that persist to the present day. Let's talk about the legacy, because the transatlantic slave trade didn't just end. It echoed. The descendants of those 12 million captives are everywhere in the Americas, from Brazil to Canada. Their presence a testament to survival against impossible odds. The cultures they created, forged from African roots and American realities, transformed music, religion, language, and cuisine across the hemisphere. The wealth extracted from their labor built institutions and fortunes that still structure economic power today. And the racism developed to justify the trade, the ideology that black people were inferior and deserving of enslavement, didn't disappear when the last ship docked. It adapted, evolved, found new expressions in segregation, discrimination, and the countless ways that societies built on slavery continue to devalue black lives. Africa itself was transformed in ways that are still being untangled. The trade depopulated regions, disrupted political systems, incentivized warfare and instability. It drained the continent of millions of people during precisely the centuries when Europe was industrializing and gaining the technological advantages that would enable colonization. The relationship between the slave trade and Africa's subsequent colonial experience is complex, but the two are clearly connected, the one laying groundwork for the other. The borders drawn by European colonizers, the ethnic tensions exacerbated by colonial policies, the economic structures oriented toward extraction rather than development, all of these have roots that reach back to the era of the slave trade. And what of the survivors themselves, the ones who endured the capture, survived the march, lived through the Middle Passage, and built lives under slavery? They carried trauma that we're only beginning to understand how to talk about. They also carried knowledge, skills, traditions, and memories that they passed down to children, who would pass them to their children in turn. The cultural persistence of African traditions in the Americas, visible in music and dance and food and religious practice, represents an act of preservation against a system designed to erase everything. Every drumbeat that echoes African rhythms, every spiritual that encodes African religious concepts in Christian language, every word in American languages that traces back to Yoruba or Kikongo or Wolof, is evidence that the enslaved people refused to be completely unmade. They survived, they remembered, they created. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about the scale of what we've discussed. 12 million people, 400 years, 3 continents, countless lives lived under conditions of unimaginable brutality. Think about the resistance, the survival, the persistence of humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. Think about the wealth generated and where it went, the poverty created and where it stayed. Think about the long shadow that falls across the present from those centuries of horror, visible in economic inequality, in racial injustice, in the very maps and borders that define our world. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't ancient history that ended cleanly. It was the foundation of the modern world, and we're still living in the house it built. But think also of the survivors. Think of the people who lived through the Middle Passage and found ways to continue. Think of their descendants, who number in the hundreds of millions today, who created cultures and communities, who fought for freedom and often won. Think of the resilience it took to build anything at all from the wreckage the trade left behind. That resilience is the other legacy, the one that stands against the horror, that insists on life and beauty and hope even in the darkest circumstances. The trade tried to reduce human beings to commodities, to units of labor, to entries in a ledger. It failed. The people it tried to destroy are still here, still remembering, still creating, still refusing to be erased. Let that thought carry you into peaceful sleep, holding both the weight of the history and the persistence of those who survived it. Congratulations, you've just woken up on a beach in South Carolina. The good news is that you're alive. The bad news is that you're about to charge into almost certain death, and the country you're fighting for isn't even sure you deserve to wear the uniform. You open your eyes, and the first thing you notice is sand. It's everywhere. In your boots, in your hair, grinding between your teeth like tiny shards of glass. The July heat is already oppressive, even though the sun is still climbing, and sweat soaks through your wool uniform in ways that make every movement uncomfortable. The fabric clings to your skin, heavy and damp, chafing in places you'd rather not think about. Your rifle lies beside you, and for a moment you forget where you are. Then you remember. You're a soldier in the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. You're black, and tonight you're going to war. The beach stretches ahead of you, Morris Island, a narrow strip of sand and scrub grass pointing toward Charleston Harbor like an accusatory finger. Seabirds wheel overhead, indifferent to the human drama unfolding below. The salt air fills your lungs, tangy and thick, mixing with the smell of unwashed men and the distant sulfur of gunpowder. At the end of that finger sits Fort Wagner, a massive earthwork fortress bristling with cannons and packed with Confederate soldiers who would rather die than see you succeed. Between you and that fort is nothing but open ground, a killing field designed by geography and improved by military engineering. You're going to run across it, in the dark, while they shoot at you. And somehow, you volunteered for this. Let's back up. Let's talk about how you got here, because your presence on this beach is itself a miracle, a revolution, an act of defiance against everything America has told itself about who you are. 6 months ago, you weren't a soldier. You might have been a laborer, hauling cargo on the docks of Boston or Philadelphia. You might have been a farmer, working soil that would never be yours, no matter how hard you worked it. You might have been a skilled tradesman, a carpenter, or blacksmith whose abilities were grudgingly acknowledged but never properly compensated. You might have been a fugitive, a man who'd tasted slavery's lash and run north with nothing but the clothes on your back and a burning determination never to be property again. Or you might have been free your whole life, born in a northern state where slavery was illegal, but freedom was still circumscribed by 1,000 petty humiliations, 1,000 daily reminders that your skin marked you as other, as less, as not quite American, despite the generations your family had lived on this soil. When the war started in 1861, you wanted to fight, You begged to fight. Black men across the North flooded recruiting offices, offering their services to crush the Confederacy, to end slavery, to prove their worth as citizens and as men. You stood in line with your neighbors, men whose ancestors had fought in the Revolution, men whose labor built the cities and tilled the fields and created the wealth that white America took for granted. You were ready. You were willing. You were turned away. The government said no. The official position was that this was a white man's war. President Lincoln worried that enlisting black soldiers would push the border states toward the Confederacy. Kentucky and Missouri and Maryland, slave states that remained in the Union, might bolt if Washington armed the very people their economies depended on enslaving. White soldiers threatened to desert rather than serve alongside you. Newspapers mocked the very idea of armed black men, running cartoons depicting you as buffoons, as children playing dress-up, as dangers to white womanhood. The message was clear. Your country needed saving, but you weren't welcome to save it. Stay home. Let the white folks handle this. Know your place. You watched from the sidelines as the Union stumbled through defeat after defeat. Bull Run, where Green troops broke and ran back to Washington in panic. The Peninsula Campaign, where a massive army crept toward Richmond and then retreated in confusion. Fredericksburg, where Union soldiers charged uphill into Confederate guns in one of the war's most pointless slaughters. Battles lost by white generals leading white soldiers who apparently didn't need your help losing. You read the casualty lists in newspapers, the columns of names stretching on, and you thought about the contributions you could make, the difference you could make, if only they'd let you. Then things changed. The war dragged on into its second year, then threatened to stretch into a third. The initial enthusiasm faded into a grim understanding that this would be long and bloody, that the Confederacy wouldn't collapse on its own. That victory would require more men than volunteering could provide. The draft became necessary, and draft riots exploded in northern cities, white mobs attacking black neighborhoods in New York, burning buildings, lynching anyone they could catch. Their rage at being conscripted redirected onto the people they blamed for the war. Meanwhile, in Washington, the calculus shifted. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, declaring slaves in rebel states forever free. The proclamation was a war measure, justified by military necessity, limited in scope to places where Union authority didn't actually reach. It freed no one immediately, but it changed the nature of the war, transformed it from a fight to preserve the Union into a fight to end slavery. And crucially, the proclamation also authorized the enlistment of black soldiers. Suddenly, the door cracked open, not because white America had a change of heart about your humanity, but because white America was running out of bodies to throw at Confederate guns. Massachusetts moved first. Governor John Andrew was an abolitionist, a man who'd fought slavery his entire political career, and he received permission to raise a regiment of black troops. The 54th Massachusetts would be the first black regiment recruited in the North, though not the first in the Union Army. Louisiana and South Carolina had already formed units from former slaves. Contraband regiments composed of men who'd fled bondage and picked up rifles almost as soon as they reached Union lines. But the 54th would be different. This regiment would be recruited from free black men, educated men, men who could read and write and argue, men who would represent the race before a skeptical nation. The pressure was enormous. If you failed, if you ran, if you proved the racists right about black cowardice, the door that had cracked open would slam shut forever. Every black man who hoped to wear a uniform, every enslaved person who dreamed of liberation at gunpoint, every future generation that might claim citizenship through military service. All of it depended on you. You answered the call. Maybe you walked into a recruiting office in Boston, a cramped room thick with cigar smoke and nervous and energy, and signed papers that might as well have been your death warrant. Maybe you traveled from Philadelphia or New York, or further still, from Ohio or Michigan or Canada, hundreds of miles for the chance to enlist. Frederick Douglass himself urged black men to join, his voice thundering from podiums and newspaper columns, and his own sons, Louis and Charles, were among the first to sign up. Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters US, Douglass declared. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. You believed him. You wanted those brass letters. You wanted that eagle. You wanted the right to fight for your own freedom, rather than waiting for white saviors to grant it. Camp Meigs, outside Boston, in the town of Redville, became your home. You arrived to find chaos and purpose in equal measure. Men from all over the Equator North poured in, speaking different dialects, carrying different histories, united by the color of their skin and the fire in their bellies. Some were born free, their families established in northern cities for generations. Some had escaped slavery, bearing scars on their backs that testified to the world they'd fled. Some had purchased their own freedom, dollar by painful dollar, working overtime for years to buy themselves from masters who set prices designed to be impossible. You learned their names, their stories, the families they'd left behind, the families still in chains that they hoped to liberate. At night, in the barracks, conversations ran long. You talked about what you were fighting for, what you'd do after the war, whether the country would keep its promises. You talked about fear. Everyone was afraid. Nobody admitted it during the day, when the officers were watching, when you had to be strong and confident, and everything the racists said you couldn't be. At night, in whispered voices, you could acknowledge the terror. The white officers arrived, most of them abolitionists from prominent Massachusetts families, men who'd risked social standing and political futures by agreeing to command black troops. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw was 25 years old, the son of wealthy reformers who dedicated their lives to the anti-slavery cause. He was a veteran of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, where he'd seen enough combat to know exactly what awaited. He was reserved, serious, uncertain at first whether this command was an honor or a punishment. His letters home revealed doubts he never showed the men. But he came, he stayed, he committed. The men watched him carefully in those early weeks. Could he be trusted? Would he lead them into fire or abandon them at the first sign of trouble? Would he see them as soldiers or as specimens? Shaw proved himself slowly, through small acts of respect, through shared hardship, through his willingness to fight alongside you rather than simply command from behind. When he addressed you, he looked you in the eye. When he spoke about the regiment's mission, his voice carried conviction. You began to believe in him. You had to believe in someone. Training was brutal. You marched until your feet bled, then marched more, learning to ignore the pain because pain was going to be a constant companion. You drilled until your arms ached from holding the rifle at shoulder arms, until your shoulders burned from the weight of the pack. You learned to load and fire the Springfield rifled musket, a process involving a dozen precise steps that had to become automatic, because in combat, you wouldn't have time to think. Bite the cartridge, pour the powder, seat the ball, ram it home, cap the nipple, aim, fire. The sequence repeated until your hands moved without your mind, until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. You learned to fix bayonets. That terrifying moment when the rifle became a spear and combat became personal. You learned to move as a unit through simulated chaos, maintaining formation while instructors shouted and drums pounded and smoke obscured everything. The white instructors pushed hard because they knew what was coming. The Confederacy had announced that any black soldier captured would be returned to slavery or executed. Any white officer commanding black troops would be treated as a criminal inciting servile insurrection, a hanging offense. The official policy was no quarter, no mercy, no recognition of your status as legitimate combatants. If you were captured, you would die or wish you had. If you surrendered, you would die. The only options were victory or death, and even victory seemed uncertain given the odds you'd be facing. The instructors drilled you harder than they would have drilled white recruits because the stakes were higher, because failure meant not just your death, but the death of hope for everyone who looked like you. Some insults came too, from your own side. When the 54th marched through Boston on the way to the front, crowds gathered to watch, some cheering, some silent, some openly hostile. White soldiers jeered from the sidewalks, questioning your manhood, predicting you'd run at the first shot. When you boarded transport ships, white crew members refused to share mess halls. They'd carry you to war, but wouldn't eat beside you. The pay was insulting. $10 a month for black soldiers versus $13 for white, with $3 deducted for clothing that white soldiers received free. The math was simple. Your life was worth less. Your service was worth less. Your sacrifice was worth less. The regiment refused the unequal pay entirely. Every man voting to serve without compensation, rather than accept inferior wages. You would fight for free rather than accept less than what you deserved. The gesture was principled and painful. Families back home needed that money. Wives and children, and aging. Parents depended on those dollars. But honor mattered more than bread. You couldn't let them buy your dignity for $3 a month. The ship carried you south, through waters patrolled by Confederate raiders, past coastlines held by enemy forces. The voyage took days, the ocean swelling beneath you, the horizon empty and unchanging. Some men had never been to sea. They vomited over the rails, grew pale and weak, wondered if drowning might be preferable. You watched dolphins racing alongside the hull and tried not to think about what waited at the other end. You landed in South Carolina in June 1863, the heart of secession country, the very place where the war began, when Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The state that started the war would now face armed black men fighting to end it. The heat was staggering. Nothing like Massachusetts summers. Nothing like anything you'd experienced. The humidity wrapped around you like a wet blanket that you couldn't remove, couldn't escape, couldn't do anything about except endure. Your wool uniform became a portable torture device, heavy and hot, and seemingly designed to maximize misery. Sweat poured off you constantly, soaking through every layer, leaving salt stains on everything. Insects discovered you with enthusiasm. Mosquitoes swarmed at dusk, whining in your ears, leaving welts that itched for days. Sand fleas burrowed into your skin. Things you couldn't name and didn't want to examine too closely left marks on every exposed inch. The food was bad. Hardtack and salt pork and coffee so weak, it barely deserved the name. The water was worse, drawn from swamps and streams, brown and brackish, and probably carrying diseases you couldn't pronounce. Sickness swept through the ranks. Men who'd survived the journey from bondage to freedom, who'd endured slavery's horrors and escaped north through impossible odds, died of dysentery in swampy camps, their bodies buried in unmarked graves far from anyone who loved them. Your first real fight came on James Island, July 16th, 2 days before Wagner. The regiment was tasked with holding a rearguard position, while white units retreated from a failed reconnaissance. Confederate forces pressed forward, sensing weakness, eager to punish the retreat. You formed a line, waited, watched the grey uniforms emerge from the tree line. The order came to fire. The rifle kicked against your shoulder. Smoke obscured everything. You reloaded, fired again, reloaded, fired again. The sequence automatic now. Your training taking over while your mind floated somewhere above the chaos. Men fell around you, but the line held. You didn't run. Nobody ran. The Confederates eventually withdrew, unwilling to pay the price your rifles demanded. The action was small, a skirmish really, a footnote in the military history, but it mattered. Word spread through the Union Army. The 54th could fight. The 54th would stand. Now the question was whether you could attack. And so we arrive at July 18th, 1863. You've been on your feet since before dawn. The regiment marched through the day, 6 miles across sandy ground that sucked at your boots with every step, without food, without adequate rest, under a sun that seemed personally malicious. The plan was for the Navy to bombard Fort Wagner all day, softening the defenses, killing the garrison, reducing the walls to rubble so that you could walk in over ruins and corpses. You heard the guns thundering from miles away, watched shells arc through the sky like falling stars and explode against the walls. Surely nothing could survive that. Surely the fort would be a smoking crater by nightfall. You arrive at the staging area around 6 in the evening. The sun is sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in oranges and reds that would be beautiful if they weren't illuminating the place where you're about to die. The colors remind you of something. A sunset you watched once with someone you loved, a memory that feels like it belongs to another person in another lifetime. General George Strong, commanding the assault brigade, rides up and addresses the regiment. He points to Fort Wagner, that massive dark shape squatting at the end of the beach, and asks if the 54th will lead the attack. The honor of leading is also the honor of dying first. Everyone understands this. Colonel Shaw says yes before anyone can object. You're going in first. You're going to show the world what black soldiers can do, even if showing the world means dying in the demonstration. Shaw walks along the line, speaking quietly to men he's come to know over months of training and hardship. His face is pale, composed, unreadable. Later, survivors will say he seemed to know he wouldn't come back. He asks a sergeant to keep the colors flying no matter what. He gives orders to write letters, to settle affairs, to say the things that need to be said before they can't be said anymore. He hands his personal effects to a journalist for safekeeping. His watch, his letters, small tokens that would mean nothing to anyone except the people who loved him. Then he takes his place at the head of the column, draws his sword, and waits for the order to advance. You stand in the ranks, gripping your rifle so tightly your knuckles ache, trying to control your breathing, trying to slow your heartbeat, trying not to think about what's coming. The men around you are silent now. No jokes, no boasts, no bravado. Just the sound of 600 men trying not to think about what comes next. The regimental flags snap in the evening breeze, silk and color against the darkening sky. The national colors, the stars and stripes you're fighting for despite everything they haven't meant for your people. The state colors of Massachusetts, white silk with the state seal, and the motto that now seems prophetic, Ense petit placidam sub libertate quietem. By the sword we seek peace, but peace only under liberty, liberty. That's what this is about, not the Union, not the Constitution, not any abstract political principle. Liberty, yours, your families, your people's. The men beside you aren't fighting for a flag, they're fighting for a future. The order comes at 7:45 p.m. The light is fading. The regiment steps off, marching in quick step toward the fort. The beach narrows as you advance, squeezed between the ocean on your right and marshland on your left. The sand drags at your boots, every step an effort. The approach funnels you into a killing zone barely 200 yards wide, no room to maneuver, nowhere to hide, nothing to do but keep walking toward the guns. The naval bombardment has stopped. The guns that were supposed to destroy the fort have fallen silent. The fort ahead looks intact, walls still standing, embrasures still gaping like dark eyes watching your approach. The optimistic reports were wrong. The Confederates are very much alive. You march 600 yards before. They open fire. The first shells scream overhead and explode behind you, the gunners finding range, adjusting aim. Then the fire walks forward, finding flesh. Men begin to fall. The man next to you, the one who told you about his daughter last night, goes down without a sound. You don't stop. You can't stop. The regiment keeps moving. You're in quick step still, maintaining formation, following orders despite every instinct screaming at you to run, to hide, to do anything but walk calmly toward the source of the explosions. Discipline holds, training holds, pride holds. You will not give the racists the satisfaction of seeing you break. The approach takes you through a flooded ditch, waist-deep water that soaks your powder and threatens to drown the shorter men. You push through, holding your rifle above your head, feeling the muck grab at your legs like hands trying to pull you down. The water is warm, slimy, foul with things you don't want to identify. The man next to you goes under and doesn't come up. There's no time to help. There's no time for anything except forward. You keep moving. The fort looms ahead, massive walls of sand and timber, higher than you imagined, sprouting cannons that flash and roar in the gathering darkness. At 200 yards, the order comes to double quick. You're running now, legs burning, lungs screaming, the sand fighting every step. The Confederate fire intensifies. Artillery, canister shot, spreading like shotgun blasts, musket volleys from the parapet, everything they have pouring into your ranks. Men fall like wheat before a scythe. The formation begins to fray. The neat lines taught in training dissolve into something more primal. A mass of men surging forward because forward is the only option. You can see the wall now, the parapet, where Confederate soldiers stand and fire down at you. Muzzle flashes illuminating their faces for frozen instants. You can see their faces. They can see yours. The regiment hits the moat, water-filled ditch at the base of the wall. Some men jump in and struggle across. Others are cut down at the edge. Colonel Shaw reaches the base of the parapet and turns to urge his men forward. "Forward, 54th," he shouts, sword raised, silhouetted against the sky for one terrible, perfect moment. Then he's climbing, scrambling up the sandy slope, and bullets tear through him. He falls back, dead before he hits the ground. You don't see him fall. You're in the moat, struggling to keep your head above water while men die around you. The noise is indescribable, a continuous roar of gunfire and screaming and explosions that makes thought impossible. You reach the wall and start climbing. The sand shifts under your feet. You grab at wooden stakes, at anything solid, pulling yourself up while defenders above shoot down, throw grenades, stab with bayonets at anyone who reaches the top. Some men make it. Sergeant William Carney seizes the regimental colours when the bearer falls and plants them on the parapet. He'll be shot multiple times, in the head, in the chest, in the arms and legs, and still refuse to let the flag touch the ground. He'll become the first black American to receive the Medal of Honor, though the medal won't come for 37 years. Lewis Douglas, son of Frederick, fights his way to the wall and survives, writing later to his fiancée that the regiment fought like demons. Men whose names history won't remember die on that parapet, fighting hand to hand, killing and dying in the dark. You reach the top. The fighting here is chaos, shadows struggling against shadows, the flash of muzzles the only light. A Confederate soldier appears in front of you, bayonet leveled. You don't think. You react exactly as you were trained, the sequence automatic, the bayonet entering flesh with resistance you'll never forget. He falls. You step over him and keep moving. But there are too many. The regiment has been torn apart in the approach. Reinforcements that were supposed to follow have been stalled, disorganized, pinned down by the same fire that decimated your ranks. The men who made it to the wall are isolated, outnumbered, running out of ammunition. The order to fall back filters through the confusion, though many don't hear it, can't hear anything over the noise. Those who can begin the terrible retreat, back down the wall, back through the moat, back across that endless beach now littered with the bodies of friends. You make it somehow. You don't remember the retreat clearly. It exists in fragments. The face of a man you knew calling for help in the darkness. The sound of bullets whipping past your ears. The moment when something hits your leg and you stumble, but keep running because stopping means dying. You reach friendly lines as the last light fades, collapse in the sand, and lie there breathing, unable to believe you're still alive. The assault is over. Fort Wagner still stands. The 54th Massachusetts has been shattered. Of the 600 men who charged that beach, nearly half are casualties. Dead, wounded, missing, captured. Colonel Shaw lies dead on the parapet. The Confederate commander, when asked about Shaw's body, reportedly says he'll bury him with his niggers. It's meant as an insult, the ultimate degradation, denying even death its dignity. Years later, Shaw's family will refuse efforts to retrieve his body. There is no greater honor, they say, than to lie with the brave men he led. The sun rises the next morning on a beach, transformed into a graveyard. Bodies lie where they fell, already beginning to bloat in the Carolina heat. The wounded who couldn't retreat have been captured or killed. Some wounded black soldiers were reportedly murdered where they lay, denied even the minimal mercy granted to white prisoners. The regiment gathers what's left, counts the survivors, begins the terrible arithmetic of loss. Lewis Douglas writes home, "I wish we had 100,000 colored troops. We would put an end to this war. The dead can't write home. Their families will learn through official letters, through newspaper lists, through the silence that stretches into forever. You survived. You don't know why. Luck, maybe. Providence, if you believe in that sort of thing. The wound in your leg is painful, but not serious. A surgeon removes the ball, bandages you up, sends you back to your unit. You'll walk with a limp for the rest of your life. A reminder of that beach, that wall, that night. But you walked out. So many didn't. The news of the assault spreads across the country. Newspapers that had mocked black soldiers run stories of incredible bravery. The northern public reads about the 54th charge, about Colonel Shaw's death, about men who fought and died for a country that barely acknowledged their humanity. The propaganda value is immense. Recruitment of black soldiers accelerates. By the war's end, over 180,000 black men, will serve in the Union Army, comprising nearly 10% of total forces. They will fight in every theater, in over 400 engagements, earning 18 medals of honor. They will die in combat, in prison camps, of disease and neglect. They will help win a war and end slavery and change what America means, even if America won't fully honor the bargain for another century. Fort Wagner itself falls in September, abandoned by the Confederates after a prolonged siege made possible in part by the sacrifice of the 54th. Charleston, the cradle of secession, the city where the war began, holds out until February 1865. When Union forces finally enter, black soldiers are among the first through the gates. They march down streets where slaves were once sold, past buildings where the rebellion was planned, their presence a living rebuke to everything the Confederacy stood for. But that's months away. Right now, in July 1863, you're lying on a cot in a field hospital, leg throbbing, ears still ringing, trying to process what happened. Men you knew are dead. The colonel who earned your respect is dead. The regiment that trained together, sang together, promised to watch out for each other, has been cut in half. The fort still stands. By some measures, the assault was a failure. But you know better. You were there. You saw men who'd been told they were less than human climb a wall of fire and fight hand to hand with their oppressors. You saw courage that no newspaper article can fully capture. No monument can adequately honor. You saw what you were capable of, what your people were capable of, what America could be if it lived up to its promises. The assault failed to take the fort. It succeeded at something larger. It proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that black Americans would fight and die for their freedom. That proof changed history. The war continues. The 54th is rebuilt with new recruits, men who heard about the charge and wanted to be part of something larger than themselves. You become a veteran, one of the old hands who trains the newcomers, who tells them what to expect, who carries the memory of those who didn't make it. You fight in more engagements, smaller actions that don't make the history books but matter just as much to the men who bleed and die. The war ends in April 1865. Lee surrenders at Appomattox. Slavery is finished. The 13th Amendment ratifies it, carves emancipation into the Constitution itself. You helped do this. The men who died on that beach helped do this. The sacrifice meant something. The 54th Massachusetts musters out in August 1865, returning to Boston for a hero's welcome. You march through streets where crowds cheer, where Governor Andrew speaks of your bravery, your sacrifice, your service to the nation. For a moment, it feels like the beginning of something new, but you know the truth is more complicated. The war is over. The struggle isn't. The promises of reconstruction will be made and broken. The ballot will be given and taken away. The equality you fought for will be deferred for generations. The men who died at Fort Wagner will be forgotten, their graves unmarked, their names fading from memory. But you remember, you carry them with you. You'll carry them forever. And now, lying in your bed tonight, you carry them too. The men of the 54th Massachusetts were not superheroes. They were men like any others, capable of doubt and terror. They charged anyway. That's what courage means. Not the absence of fear, but the decision that something matters more than fear. They gave you that future. They bought it with blood on a beach most Americans can't find on a map. Sleep well. They're watching over you. They always have been.